what we were, of course, talking about this morning were the beginnings of the adeptic tradition, of the Western esoteric tradition in the Mediterranean area, primarily with the three great transmissions, the Neoplatonic, the Hermetic, and the Gnostic. We indicated also that there might be a need at this time to reevaluate some of our understanding, perhaps of adeptship and how the adeptic tradition works, and to perhaps not just go back to Blavatsky, but back with Blavatsky to her sources, which I indicated might be twofold. On the one hand, the experience of transcendence, the experience of the greater life, and on the other hand, the tradition which arises as the result of such experience. Now we will take a look at the manner in which this same adeptic tradition maintained itself in the part of the world which was the heartland, let's say, of the Western esoteric tradition for a long time, until, of course, the conquest of the New World in the Americas and the extensions into places like Australia, New Zealand, and various parts of Asia carried these currents to other places as well. There is a great temptation, I think, in connection with this topic to engage to a major extent in the telling of history, and most people are not very interested in history. So as much as I can, I will try to combine that with the evaluation, especially in contemporary terms, of the message and of the import of these various currents that come through us, the trajectories that come down to us through time. First of all, if we want to understand the workings of these traditions, it might help, even though all of these efforts are somewhat arbitrary, to engage in a certain amount of classification, of organizing of this material in according to some system that allows us to keep them in mind with a little greater degree of clarity than otherwise might be the case. And so I would suggest at this time that we might keep in mind that for quite a long time, in fact, perhaps reaching back into the early background of these adeptic currents, there appear to have been two main groups, or two main ways in which the tradition perpetuated itself. The one is the one that we were talking about to a considerable extent this morning, where, let's say, the admission and the selection in terms of individuals who enter the tradition occurs in an open and public manner. We mentioned that among the Hermeticists and Gnostics, and for that matter, as far as we can tell, of course, Neoplatonists also, in that rather free and unencumbered time in the Alexandrian period, would be by way of public programs where people like, say, Ammonius Saccus, the Hotheodidactos, the God-taught philosopher, would, after he has finished his day's work, because he was a porter in the harbor of Alexandria, would go into one of the public squares and start speaking about the mystical aspects of the philosophy of Plato, and then people would gather. And it is very likely that certainly Gnostics, and some Hermeticists also, would start in that manner. And then from there would be a certain selection, and then a smaller group would be selected from these public gatherings who were more interested, and from that then there would come about individual instruction under the guidance of a qualified adeptic figure. So this was the ancient pattern which was in existence at the times of really the foundations of the spiritual aspects of Western culture. But there is also another, and that is the tradition of the secret orders and secret associations. These go back, at least in terms of their method, to a major extent to the mysteries of antiquity, to such associations as the Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphic mysteries, the Dionysian mysteries, mysteries in Egypt of Isis and Osiris and so forth, where admission from the very beginning was a personal and secret procedure, and where no manner of publicity and of totally public activity was carried on at all. And these two methods of perpetuating the tradition continued down through the ages. We might also say that it is beginning to emerge now with ever greater clarity that the adeptic tradition in a primarily secret manner seems to have also existed at least for a few hundred years prior to the time of Christ in Judaism among the Jews, and that some of the latest representatives of that at the time of the foundation of the Christian era were such people as we find in the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that this was a definite representation of an esoteric tradition which then was funneled into Christian and Gnostic channels. This was then the condition for the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Christian era. Then, as we know, something happened. What happened was probably in part the result of what I would like to call the monotheistic difficulty. Life is difficult. Every kind of religious and similar tradition has its own problems, its own difficulties. And the difficulty of the monotheistic faiths is that owing to the unitary model of deity, there is a tendency to develop a one-track mind in religious terms. We are all familiar with the nice little symbols and slogans of the fundamentalists. One way, finger pointing up, everything is one way, one God, one law, one doctrine, one way of proceeding. This is something that reasserts itself in the monotheistic traditions. Cultures based on monotheistic religions seem to have a difficulty with pluralism. They might try it for a while, but they are never very comfortable with it. The reason for that being their God concept. So we find that in Judaism, we find it in Zoroastrianism, we find it in Islam, and we definitely found it in Christianity. So while the first 3.5 centuries or so of the Christian era did maintain a pluralistic condition, and various approaches to the Christian faith existed side by side with each other, not always totally harmoniously, but nevertheless, then something happened. The monotheistic difficulty reasserted itself, and by the 3rd and the 4th century, the pluralistic character of the Christian church disappeared, and the exoteric non-Gnostic mass church had began to eliminate from its ranks any open practice or teaching of the original esoteric or Gnostic element within its own body. This catastrophe has left its profound mark on all of Christendom and indeed on all of Western culture. And now the adeptic or esoteric tradition began to divide itself into three currents, of which I sketched only two up here, but the first, I think, in all honesty, also needs to be remembered, especially by persons such as us. Because the natural tendency of the human being is to consider his or her own position, his or her own tendency to be normative, and to neglect or to treat in a derogatory manner those that differ from it. So what happened to the Gnosis? What happened to the esoteric or adeptic tradition after the Christian church declared it heretical, and it could not be openly and effectively practiced outwardly any longer? The first thing that happened was that a muted and secret tradition arose within the exoteric church itself. Monastic Christendom, both in the West and in the East, had tried to preserve some of this ancient heritage. So it was never totally lost to mainstream religiosity either. It was always there. You know, one of the greatest documents of recent decades that has been discovered about these things, the famous Naj Hammadi Library of Gnostic and in part Hermetic materials of writings, was found where? It was found right at the site of the first and biggest monastic community of Christendom, which was Kenoboskion, now known as Naj Hammadi in the Egyptian desert. And as Professor Gilles Quispel, whom we talked about before, said when he was lecturing for us in Los Angeles, speaking of the founder of the Kenoboskion community, the Coptic monk Pachomius, Saint Pachomius in the Coptic church, he said, well, Saint Pachomius certainly had a strange library. Because that's where it was found. So the obvious indication being that at least some of the monks there valued these strange so-called heretical materials, and then perhaps some development occurred where they got scared and they had to hide it, so they went and buried it, and it took, well, some 1600 years or so to find it, but fortunately it was found. Now, this occurrence was not unique. Elements of the tradition continued in various ways within the Christian church itself, and at least vestiges of it can be found these days also. So those of us of esoteric and theosophical dedications need to keep in mind that while ever since the 3rd and the 4th century, it was very difficult and often terribly dangerous to openly practice and teach elements of this tradition within official Christendom. In a muted fashion, it was frequently present. And this cannot be forgotten and cannot be neglected. Coming down from the very early periods, there were always a few people, some of them of great prominence, canonized saints and church fathers, who one might say carried at least an element of this esoteric tradition with them and who emphasized it. Among these can be mentioned Clement of Alexandria, Origen, at the later period Raymond Lully, and several important church leaders including Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Francis of Assisi, Nicholas of Cusa, and others. So in this fashion, it was always there. It has, at least one branch of this has been called the ultra-realist school of Christianity. Very interesting. You would think ultra-realist is somebody who is, well, very, very down to earth, you know, and wants to have everything ultra-real. But it truly means those who were dedicated to the existence of a transcendental or supernal reality and who strove for that. They found themselves at a certain point, however, in conflict with Aristotelianism, with the coming of scholasticism, St. Thomas Aquinas and all of that, and had been driven into a minority. Also in the Eastern Church, certainly in the monastic tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Greek, Russian, Syrian, the St. Thomas Syrian Church in India and other places, important elements of the esoteric tradition continue to subsist within the apparent Orthodox structure. So that it was always, at least theoretically possible, for those who had a very great desire in that direction to find at least some of these esoteric elements if they were able to dig deeply enough within their, within the large, the exoteric church itself. I well remember almost a year ago some conversations that I had. In fact, I had the good fortune to interview him for one of our television programs that the Society did. The Archbishop of the Syrian Orthodox Church, or one of the Syrian Orthodox churches in India, Mar Paul Gregorius, very interesting man, and when we were off the camera, he made it very plain to me and to a couple of friends who were with me at the time that he was very sympathetic to the esoteric tradition and to Theosophy, that he had been to Adyar several times, that he knew Rukmini Devi, he knew everybody, and we talked about Gnosticism and Sophia and all of those things, that we were accompanying the old gentleman to the elevator, and just as he got into the elevator, he turned around to us and said with a smile, "But one speaks of these things only to the wise." This was one of the few times in my life that I was called wise. But after all, he's not the Pope, so he was not infallible in saying that. So this always needs to be kept in mind. And in addition to this, we have now the other two great traditions. Let's look first at the what might be called the open, the popular, even populist current of Gnosis, which addressed itself to the general populace, and preaching and practicing its tradition openly, even though against much persecution and pressure. Here the vast, virtually worldwide movement of Manichaeanism needs to be mentioned, founded by a great and saintly individual in the 3rd century, from about 216 to 275, the Prophet Mani in Iran. This faith, which is pure Gnosticism, albeit with an Iranian keynote, spread to Asia Minor and Asia proper, including Afghanistan, China, India, and in all likelihood into Tibet, as well as into Europe and the Middle East. In this respect, I would also like to call attention to something that one certainly does not find in the earlier literature of 19th century vintage and in the scholarship of that period, which was available to Madame Blavatsky and the earlier theosophical writers, namely that not all the light originates in the East. and that the assumption that all good things have come from India and Tibet and places like that and moved westward in every historical period is an exaggeration. The opposite had also taken place. There have been currents moving from particularly the Mediterranean area eastward. Largely in the wake of the conquest of certain parts of India of Alexander the Great. I well remember an exhibit of Buddhist religious art that was exhibited through the country a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, and I don't know whether it was exhibited in the same way in other cities, but in Los Angeles they had a very clever way of showing it. The artworks were displayed along the walls of a fairly long and kind of winding corridor, and so when you entered the corridor, you were confronted with the earliest works of Buddhist religious art, and then you kept going. When you came to the end, you came more or less to the present. So you started at the beginning. And you know what the earliest examples of Buddhist religious art, mainly statuary, looked like? They looked like Greek statues. They looked like Praxiteles work, right out of Greece. Well, how did that happen? It happened because the Greek warriors of Alexander and all the various people with them went to India, and they had brought their art with them, and apparently the people there liked their methods of sculpting. Now, if that happened with sculpture, it certainly also very easily could have happened in other ways. And so we find that there is an increasing amount of likelihood of the movement, especially within the Alexandrian period, of some of this spirituality toward the east. And we find remnants of particularly Manichaean communities in all kinds of far-off places in Asia. And we find local traditions that seem to point to perhaps Manichaean influences at an earlier time. So it was a very great movement. But of course it did not only move to the east, but it also moved into Europe. In Europe, a relative of the Manichaean tradition resurfaced in the form of the Cathar, or as it has earlier been called the Albigensian faith, in the Languedoc area of what is now the south of France, where it maintained itself for about a period of 100 years between the 1100s and the 1200s. The Cathar means pure, and the Cathar tradition remained one of the most important sources of esoteric currents in Europe. Much like Valentinian Gnostics, the Cathars' chief objective was the liberating of human souls from earthly bondage. First by teachings and lifestyle that was calculated to bring about an ever-increasing state of purity, and leading up to the supreme sacrament of the consolamentum, which sealed the individual to heaven, to the fullness, to the true God, and which allowed the individual's spirit to leave the confinement of earthly darkness in the afterworld. Something not entirely unlike at least aspects of the Tibetan Bardo. So in fact you might say this was the only large, popular and prolonged manifestation of the Gnostic tradition throughout the entirety of Christian dominance in Europe. It was treated ultimately in an extremely forceful and cruel manner by the Church and by the kings of France. A crusade was preached against the Cathars, the only crusade ever led against fellow Christians. The the Holy Inquisition was organized for the first time in history to exterminate the Cathars, and did a rather good job of doing so. Of course, like all bureaucratic organizations, it didn't go out of business after the Cathars were done away with, but then they found other people to deal with in a similar manner, right up into as far as the 18th and the 19th century. So a very great and tragic development had taken place, which ended with the defeat and the execution of very large numbers of these people. Somehow the extermination of the Cathars was never forgotten. And it, along with something else that we will mention in a few minutes, the suppression of the Templar order and the execution of the leadership of the Knights Templar, these two, the Cathar Crusade and the fate of the Templars, remained two of the great festering wounds in the closer sense in the psyche, in the soul of France, and in a wider sense in the soul of Europe. And somehow they always reappear again. And over the last few decades, we have seen a veritable Cathar renaissance arising, and its effects being felt not only in France, but in many other places, including the United States. Beginning earlier in this century, already people began to address themselves to rediscovering the heritage of the Cathars. Among these were the the German poet and writer Nicolas Lénard, the French poet Maurice Mager, the French scholar Déodat Rocher, and a number of other people. And in our days, just since the 1970s or so, a great deal of attention came to be focused on the Cathars by way of the researches and the writings of the British psychiatrist Dr. Arthur Girdham, who discovered first one and subsequently a number of people, all living in England, who were his patients, who had what appeared to be fairly vivid and troubling memories of their own lives, and more significantly unhappy deaths among the Cathars. I think we have the distinction of having Quest Books, Theosophical Publishing House, of having republished the key work of Girdham in that respect back in the 70s in this country, called The Cathars and Reincarnation. That was his first book on that, was followed by The Great Heresy and a number of others. Now again, this was an openly practiced religion. There was nothing secret about it. People would, for a number of years, listen to the Cathar teachers and absorb the principles of the faith, and if then they decided to become more closely associated with the mysteries, then they would undergo a ceremony, the ceremony of the Consolamentum, and then they became part of what might be called the Cathar clergy, both men and women on an equal basis. And these were called the perfecti, those who had been perfected and initiated. Now you might ask yourselves, what indications are there that these people were connected with anything of an adeptic nature that might resemble adeptship as we understand it in Theosophy? I didn't bring it with me here, but there is one of the few books on this subject of an authoritative nature that has been translated into English, is a little book by the French poet Maurice Mager called The Return of the Magi. Mager is not considered a reputable scholar or historian, just like our theosophical writers are not considered reputable. Even such outstanding scholars like G.R.S. Mead and so forth are always sort of shunted aside, which however does not diminish their importance. Well, Maager was privy to certain traditions and legends which circulated in the Languedoc and which he wrote down. And among these he mentioned that there appeared to have been a what he called the secret master of the Cathars. That there was a mysterious shadowy figure who appeared at a certain point and who presided over one of the early great Cathar councils. One of his names might have been, or one of the figures with whom this adept is associated was the Bulgarian Cathar bishop Nicetas, an emissary who came from the east, but whose presence was such that just being around him for even short periods of time would change the lives of people. And that this was the man more than anyone else who was responsible for establishing the Cathar tradition in France. Definitely an adeptic figure. After the extinguishing of the light of the Cathars, a very dark period certainly set in. And it was quite well understood in the wake of that terrible catastrophe that the open practice of the tradition was no longer possible. And so other open popular and populist manifestations had to wait until after the fall of the Bourbon throne, allied as it was to the Catholic Church. And so after the French Revolution in the 19th century, the popular gnosis made itself known, and for the first time primarily under the name of magic. And its great prophet and reviver was a lovely and interesting person by the name of Eliphas Levi Zahed. At least that was his nom de plume, his family name having been Alphonse Louis Constant. Eliphas Levi died in 1875, the very year in which, of course, the Theosophical Society was founded. 33 different times HPB refers to Eliphas Levi in her work Isis. His role is even greater when assessed in terms of the influence within the Western tradition. Hermetic, Kabbalistic and magical philosophy based upon his teachings. After more than 100 years, he is really beginning to emerge as a person as well, and not only a shadowy author of a few strange out-of-print books. Levi was definitely inspired. At the present time, if you would like to look into his life and teachings, there are two biographies of him extant, one by the French author Paul Chacornac, which is only in French, and one, however, which I think has been recently reprinted by Thomas Williams in English, entitled Eliphas Levi, Master of Occultism. Very, very well written and very interesting book. Levi had summarized, let us say, practically all the available features of the, at least the Western esoteric tradition in his day, primarily under the auspices of the Kabbalah. He was also the first person to combine the Kabbalah and the Tarot. His books were publicly available, although he had been imprisoned a couple of times for appearing to be a political subversive. They always let him out again, and they allowed him to publish his books. H.P. Blavatsky, of course, as I just indicated, and many others were greatly inspired by his work, which became the fountainhead of a lot of further developments. Things were never the same after Eliphas Levi. You might say the esoteric cat was out of the bag for everyone to see. Repressive governments still came and went in France and in other European countries, but the alternative reality tradition was out in the open and on the march. Levi's approach led directly to at least the kindly and often enthusiastic reception accorded in Europe to the Theosophical Society, which came to establish itself soon after Eliphas Levi's death in France, and which was, of course, an open organization and not a secret initiatic order. The Theosophical Society set the pattern for numerous organizations of a similar kind, engaging in generally available public teaching, such as the Anthroposophical Society of Rudolf Steiner and others. The open, popular approach to esotericism was thus reborn and is still with us. So that is one arm of the descent, so to say. But there was, and there still continues, another. This is the other current of European esotericism, the one of the secret orders or initiatic fraternities, which in various forms played a key role in keeping alive the esoteric tradition. The oldest manifestation of this was the Order of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were one of several great crusading knightly orders, orders of knight monks or monk knights, whichever way you want to phrase it, that came into existence during the Crusades. We need to remember that the Crusades were also more than cruel and terrible and rapacious military campaigns, which of course they were. They also represented the symbolic journey to the east of the deracinated and deprived medieval psyche. People in the Middle Ages felt deeply within their souls that something was missing in their religion, in their spiritual lives. Something was wrong, something was lost. And they traveled first as pilgrims, and when their pilgrimages were interrupted as crusaders to the east, hoping that by going to the physical locale, the sacred space, where their religion started, where their savior figure lived and died and resurrected, they might find a new light for their spirit. Well, a lot of them just found death and bloodshed, and others found all kinds of spurious relics, which they carted back to Europe. It is said that at least one and possibly several large battleships could have been built out of the fragments of the true cross. You know, these things went on during the Crusades, but something else also went on, and there were some who apparently discovered something. And among these were apparently at least a small circle of leading knights of the Knights Templar. That order being founded in 1118 in the Holy Land by Hugh de Payen and a number of other French knights, all of whom were relatives of the mysterious and extremely powerful figure known as Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a Burgundian nobleman who became the reviver of the Cistercian order. and who was a great foe of rationalism and of the scholastics, and a great defender of a peculiar mysticism of his own, which was primarily directed toward the Virgin Mary and the feminine figure of the Holy Wisdom. You can't sell Saint Bernard short. He was a very interesting fellow, and in addition to his major accomplishment of lending his name to a certain canine species noted in the Alps, he had some important accomplishments. So, H.P.B. states in Isis Unveiled in the second volume, page 380, the temple, which is always the way the French refer to the Order of the Templars, was the last European secret organization which as a body had in its possession some of the mysteries of the East. And she also writes, its true aim was the restoration of the ancient worship. The Templar order endured openly until 1314, when on March 19 the last Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burnt at the stake as a heretic, after having languished in prison for about a year. And the question once again being, what mysteries, what ancient worship, what was it that the Templars had gotten hold of in the Middle East? When we add up all the evidence, the indications are that the Templars must have contacted some probably small and dwindling esoteric group, probably a group of Gnostic Christians or something of that sort. There might have been Mandeans or Elkasites of some sort, and because Mandeans are still in existence particularly in Iraq and in certain parts of Iran, and received some kind of esoteric transmission of a Gnostic or Gnosticizing kind from them, which they carried with them, held secret, but the news eventually leaked out and they were put down. Undoubtedly that wasn't the only reason, but certainly this was used as the primary pretext for getting rid of them. And once again, it was quite commonly understood in France and in other parts of Europe, because there were Templar organizations, order houses in other countries, England, Portugal, Germany, elsewhere, that the manner in which the Templar order was suppressed and the people were executed was a great and terrible injustice, and the sympathy with the Templars and what they stood for continued, and it became the other, let's say, major great wound in the side of European Christendom. Four other major secret orders played a great role, all at a somewhat later time in the esoteric tradition in Europe, to wit, the Rosicrucian order, the Masonic order with its many different jurisdictions into which it fragmented later on, the Masonic, that is the Masonic order, the Martinist order, and a latecomer, short-lived latecomer of still considerable influence, the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn. Rosicrucianism was of German origin, and its legendary founder, Christian Rosenkreuz, a figure who is supposed to have lived fairly shortly after the time of the Reformation. Once again, according to Maurice Mager, the romantic and yet at a certain intuitive level well-informed French writer about the Cathars. Incidentally, a friend of mine who just returned from France and from visiting Montségur had told me that there is a monument to Maurice Mager on the road as you climb up to Montségur Castle. There are only two monuments there, one to the burnt ones, to the Cathars themselves, erected by Déodat Rocher, and his group. Rocher was a friend and one-time associate of Rudolf Steiner and became a great researcher in Cathar lore, and to Maurice Mager. Maurice Mager has an interesting adeptic story to tell. He says that Christian Rosenkreuz, the mysterious founder figure of the Rosicrucians, was in fact the last surviving son of a German Cathar family by the name of von Germishausen. All of his relatives were killed off because they were Cathars. He went to the Middle East, to Damascus in Syria and Fez in Morocco, and upon his return founded the mysterious Fraternity of the Brothers of the Rosy Cross, which for several hundred years after his alleged life was totally secret, so secret and so mysterious in fact that most scholars to this day believe that it did not really exist. However, certainly several hundred years later, in Napoleonic times, in the early 19th century and the very late 18th century, there was a great revival of Rosicrucian activity, particularly in Germany, where at least one king of Prussia, many German princes, and illustrious people, both in politics and the arts and literature and so forth, were active within it. As just a little vignette, I might mention something here that is fairly interesting. By this time, the secret orders started proliferating, and Masonry was, of course, already present. And now a certain difficulty arose in connection with rationalism. The secret orders, particularly the Masonic order and its various branches, were beginning to use the rationalism of the Enlightenment as a weapon against primarily the Catholic Church, in Germany also against the Lutheran establishment to some extent. It is very likely that even people like Voltaire and so forth were really secretly quite interested in and possibly inspired by certain aspects of the esoteric tradition, but they used the rationalist arguments in order to break the power of their enemy, the Catholic Church. And a very interesting book was published about this years ago called The Esoteric Substance of the Thought of Voltaire. Very weird, one would not think. I think it was published by Philosophical Library in the late 60s or in the 70s. Voltaire, of course, was a prominent Mason, had a big Masonic funeral at which Benjamin Franklin was present. But some other people in the esoteric orders, particularly among the German Rosicrucians, began to get worried. They said, too much rationalism, this is going to go too far, this is going to result in materialism, and so they tried to revive the mysticism of their tradition and of the esoteric tradition, indeed the deeper mysteries of the Christian tradition. I should have quit by now, so I better go on. Another order which roughly falls into the same category is the Martinist order, which is French in origin and bears the name of two of its founders, of Martinez de Pasquale and of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, le philosophe inconnu, which was then greatly revived and popularized in the 19th century by the illustrious Papius, Dr. Gérard Encausse, who revived the Martinist order, and it became a highly regarded secret organization in many different places in Europe, especially in Russia. Even the Tsar and members of his family belonged to it for a period of time. And this was all part of the 19th century revival. And then, of course, there is the last The last one, the latecomer on the scene, founded toward the end of the 19th century in 1888 in London, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which received apparently its commission from some mysterious late Rosicrucian group in Germany, but all of the leading members of which were English. One of its founders was the redoubtable Dr. W. Wynne Westcott, a medical doctor and close friend and disciple of HPB, who contributed, I think, all of the entries on Kabbalistic and related materials to the Theosophical Glossary, where you find some of the entries with www. Those are not by HPB, but by Westcott. Largely because of her friendship with Westcott, and also because of her regard for the great poet, who at that time was still quite young, William Butler Yeats. HPB lent her approbation, at least to the presence of some of her associates and pupils in the Golden Dawn, and I could say much more about that, and I have on other occasions, but I won't now. But let me just say this, that at least in my opinion, this short-lived organization became a very important creative matrix of the esoteric tradition of the Western sort, and almost all of the writings, teachings that are now present in the world and that are of any value, having to do with Kabbalah, having to do with Tarot, having to do with various aspects of the Western esoteric tradition, go back to the Golden Dawn. That there were a few less worthy members, most of whom had left the order and were not part of it, such as the redoubtable rascal Edward Alistair Crowley, is true, but to blame Mr. Crowley on the Golden Dawn is rather like making the Catholic Church responsible for Martin Luther, for Calvin, and heaven knows, perhaps even for the Branch Davidians in Texas. We have then these two groupings, the open one and the secret orders, converging at this particular time. I'm past the time. Let me finish by indicating maybe there is an idea, a message here to take with us. To what extent are we in the Theosophical tradition to carry forth, let's say, both of these approaches? This is something that in this point in our history perhaps we need to sort out. Are we to be a totally open, public forum kind of an organization where in a general manner the esoteric tradition is made available to people? Or are we perhaps also to address ourselves to, let's say, practical spiritual development in a manner that is more personal, in a manner that is more secret, in a manner that is more initiatic? And if indeed we are interested in that, and this both, how can we combine it in such a way that it will be authentic and that it will lead to the greater light? Because we are part of both of these traditions. As I indicated before, we are not an isolated phenomenon. We are not just a little bit of esoteric water that bubbled to the surface accidentally and incidentally. We are a part of a great and ancient stream, which not only comes from a great source in the past, but which has been nourished all along by the adeptic presence of great pneumatics, of great and holy souls who were able to reach into the source of the living waters. And I think if we address ourselves to that also, and if we sincerely reach for these vivifying waters ourselves, then we need not worry about the future of the esoteric tradition. We need not be concerned or even despair over the future of the Theosophical tradition. For in their source, in its adepts, in that great world of light which they represent and which they make available to us, is our past, is our present, is our future. That is our abiding hope. Thank you very much.